The first time I decided to go camping alone was because I needed a break. Life had been chaotic. Work, personal stuff, the usual grind of living in a city that never seemed to stop moving. Everything was just too much. I felt like I was constantly drowning in noise, and I just needed to get away, find some peace. So, I planned a solo camping trip in a remote area about 3 hours outside of town. The forest was secluded, quiet, and exactly what I thought I needed to clear my head. I'd camped before, but never by myself. It was something I had wanted to do for a while, though. The idea of being out there, alone with nothing but the sounds of nature, seemed perfect. I researched the area, got the gear I thought I'd need, and set out on a Friday afternoon. The weather was perfect, clear skies, cool breeze, and the kind of crisp air that makes you feel alive. The campsite I had picked was in a national forest. There was a trailhead about a mile away, and the area around it was supposed to be quiet, almost untouched by people. I thought it would be the perfect spot to clear my mind, get away from everything. When I arrived, everything looked just like I expected. The woods were dense, but there was enough of a clearing to set up camp. It was the middle of the afternoon, and the sun filtered through the trees in a soft, golden light. I felt that initial relief, the feeling that comes from stepping away from the chaos of everyday life. There was a small creek nearby, and I set up my tent near it, close enough to hear the soothing rush of the water as it moved through the rocks. As I unpacked my gear and settled in, the only sounds were the chirping of birds and the rustling of the leaves. I lit a small fire, gathered some wood, and began to cook my dinner. The scent of the food and the warmth of the fire made me feel even more at ease. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I knew it was just me and the forest, but something about the silence seemed unnerving, like the calm before something unexpected. I ate my meal in the fading daylight, taking my time, enjoying the solitude. By the time I finished eating, the sky had turned a deep shade of purple. The air had gotten cooler, and the firelight cast long shadows on the trees. I was starting to feel the isolation, though, not in a bad way, but there was something unsettling about being out there alone, in the woods, surrounded by nothing but the sounds of nature. I'd planned to spend the night reading, but I found myself just staring into the fire. The longer I sat there, the more aware I became of the noises around me. The birds had gone silent, and the wind had picked up a little, causing the trees to creak. It was a strange stillness in the air, like everything was holding its breath. I tried to push the feeling aside, chalking it up to the unfamiliarity of the situation. Around midnight, the fire was dying down. The cold had fully set in, and I was considering going into my tent to get some sleep. But then I heard something. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make me stop. A rustling in the bushes. Not the soft movement of small animals, but something larger. The kind of noise that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I froze. My heart started to race, and I felt that familiar knot of unease tighten in my stomach. The rustling continued, moving closer to my campsite. I couldn't tell what it was. It could have been a deer or maybe even a bear, though I hadn't seen any signs of large wildlife near the area when I set up camp. I tried to stay calm, but the thought of being alone in the woods at night made my mind run wild. I slowly reached for the knife I had tucked into the side pocket of my bag. It was the only weapon I had, and I figured if something was out there, I needed to be ready. My breath felt shallow as I listened intently to the sounds around me, trying to make sense of them. The rustling stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. The air felt thicker, and I could sense something, some presence, just beyond the trees. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a small deer, but every instinct in my body was screaming that it was something more. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the sweat starting to bead on my forehead. I gripped the knife tighter. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my ears straining for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. I had no idea what had caused the noise. Could have been a breeze or something large moving through the underbrush. But the longer I sat there, the more my mind convinced me that it was something dangerous. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight and stood up, moving cautiously around the campfire. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees, the rocks, the shadows. I swept the light across the area, scanning for anything out of place. But there was nothing. The quiet was almost deafening. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself that I was being paranoid. There was no reason to think anything was wrong, right? I was just spooked by the isolation, the unknown. But as I turned back to my tent, I saw something. It was quick, just a flash of movement between the trees. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. I didn't know what I had seen, but I was sure I had seen something. Someone. It was too quick to make out clearly, but it was unmistakable. Figure, person. My mind started racing again. I wasn't sure who or what it was, but the last thing I wanted was to stick around and find out. I quickly doused the fire, packed up my essentials, and moved as quietly as I could to the far side of the campsite. The flashlight was still in my hand, but I held it at my side, barely shining it around. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. I moved slowly and deliberately, trying to avoid making noise as I gathered my things. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest that I could barely hear the sounds of the forest around me. I kept telling myself it was nothing, maybe just a lost hiker or someone else out camping, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't want to risk it. The thought of staying out there, in the middle of nowhere, alone with someone or something watching me was too much. I decided to leave. I grabbed my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and started walking toward the trailhead, moving as fast as I could without running. I didn't look back. Every step I took felt like an eternity. The forest seemed to close in around me, and the sounds of movement in the trees grew louder, like something was following me. The longer I walked, the more frantic I became. Couldn't help it. My mind kept going over the figure I'd seen, and I kept imagining it getting closer, moving just behind me in the darkness. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was exhausted, my legs aching, my breathing shallow. I had no idea if I was just overreacting or if something had really been out there. But as I reached the road, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I wasn't alone anymore. I wasn't out in the wilderness, surrounded by whatever was lurking in the shadows. I didn't stop to rest. I didn't want to stay there longer than I had to. I kept walking, following the road back to the nearest town. In the end, I didn't ever go back to that campsite. Something about that night, the feeling that I wasn't alone, stayed with me. I couldn't shake the image of the figure moving between the trees, the feeling that I had barely escaped whatever was out there. And as I look back now, I'm not sure what I would have done if things had gone differently. But one thing was clear. That night, I learned that there's a difference between being alone and being truly isolated. And sometimes, you don't realize how vulnerable you are until it's too late. It was supposed to be a simple weekend camping trip with a few friends. Just a quick getaway into the woods to unwind, have some beers, and enjoy the quiet. We set up camp in a small national forest a few hours outside of town. We'd been here before, so we knew the area, and we were familiar with the layout of the campground. Nothing fancy, just a couple of tents, a fire, some camping chairs, and the usual mess of gear we brought with us every time. We'd arrived in the late afternoon, set up our tents, and spent the evening around the fire. It was all pretty standard: chit-chat, beer, the usual campfire songs, and the constant crackle of the fire. The sun had just dipped below the horizon when I started to feel the rumble in my stomach. The kind of rumble that you can't ignore. It was about 10 p.m., and the campsite was quiet, save for the distant sounds of nature. I wasn't too worried. The restrooms were about a quarter of a mile away from our site, and I had no problem walking there. The path was dark, but there was enough moonlight that I could see just enough to make my way without tripping over roots or rocks. The air was crisp, and I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders, starting down the path toward the restroom. It was pitch black outside, the kind of dark where the only light is the faint glow from the moon above. The path was narrow, flanked by dense trees and thick bushes. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush. About halfway there, I saw movement up ahead, a figure stepping out from a narrow path that led to an unused site. I paused, trying to make out who it was. The The figure had a peculiar gait, slightly awkward, deliberate, and unmistakable. It was one of my friends, James. I recognized his walk right away. It was hard to miss. As I kept walking, I didn't think much of it at first. But as I got closer, I noticed something strange. He was moving fast, almost like he was trying to get away from something. I called out, "Hey James, what's up?" He turned around and looked at me, but his face was barely visible in the dark. "Why are you following me?" he asked, his voice muffled and distant. "I'm not following you, man," I said. "I'm just going to the bathroom." He picked up his pace, walking faster, and I thought I might have just startled him. But the further we both went, the more it felt like he was purposely trying to get away from me. Every few steps, he would turn around, always asking, "Why are you following me?" It was a strange exchange, but nothing too alarming at first. I was just trying to get to the bathroom, so I picked up my pace to catch up. As I walked faster, he moved even quicker, and before I knew it, I lost sight of him entirely. I reached the restrooms without seeing him again, and I figured maybe I had just imagined it. People get weird at night in the woods sometimes, especially when you've been drinking, right? I went into the restroom, did my business, and washed my hands. Still thinking about the weird interaction, I tried to shake it off. Maybe he was just messing with me. As I started walking back to the campsite, I was starting to forget about the encounter when I noticed something odd. When I came back to the site, James was there, sitting in his camping chair, looking relaxed and chatting with the rest of the group. Everyone was just hanging out like normal. I walked over to him, trying to make sense of what had happened. "Why are you messing with me, man?" I asked, slightly annoyed. James looked at me with a confused expression. "What are you talking about? You weren't just over by the restroom. You came from that other site. I saw you walking on the trail. Why were you trying to avoid me?" He gave me an even stranger look. "I've been here the whole time, man. What are you talking about? I've been sitting right here." Everyone else seemed just as confused. No one had seen him leave the campsite, let alone walk down the trail. I figured I was just being paranoid or maybe too drunk. I laughed it off. All right, you got me. You're messing with me. You guys are always messing with me." But something about it didn't sit right with me. I brushed it off and tried to enjoy the rest of the evening, but the feeling lingered. Around 3 a.m., I woke up again, this time needing to pee. I didn't feel like walking all the way back to the restroom, so I decided to just step off into the woods a bit. I got out of my tent and walked off into the darkness, careful to avoid the trees and underbrush. I didn't need a flashlight. I could see just enough with the dim light from the moon. I did my business and started walking back to the campsite, my mind still buzzing from earlier. As I got closer to the tents, I heard the unmistakable sound of a zipper opening. I glanced toward James's tent and saw him crawling out. The zipper noise was distinct, no mistaking it. I could barely make out his figure, but I could definitely hear him. He moved away from his tent, and I thought it was strange. I didn't know if he'd gotten up to piss, too, or if he was just getting some fresh air. He stopped, then crouched down, and I saw the glow of a cigarette lighter flick on. The flame flickered for a moment, and then the light of it illuminated his face for a split second. I saw his face clearly now. He lit the cigarette, took a deep puff, and then said, "Can you hear me?" His voice was low and distant, but I could hear it clearly. I replied, "Yeah, I can hear you. What's up?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he just repeated, "Can you hear me?" But this time it was louder, more insistent. I was getting irritated, so I said, "Yeah, I hear you. What's the deal? You trying to wake everyone up?" He shook his head at me, like he wasn't really paying attention, and then turned and walked off toward the cars. I didn't think much of it. I was just annoyed. It wasn't like him to be so strange in the middle of the night, but I figured he was just messing with me again. I started following him, thinking I'd catch him at the cars, maybe get some kind of explanation. I walked around one of the parked cars, expecting to see him standing there, but when I rounded the corner, he was gone. I stood there for a moment, confused. I looked around, thinking maybe he just ducked behind another car or maybe went off into the trees. I waited, but I didn't hear any footsteps or movement. I was pissed off now, thinking James was playing some prank on me, so I started walking back to his tent, determined to give him a piece of my mind. But when I got back to the campsite, his tent was still closed. I could hear faint snoring coming from inside. He hadn't left at all. I couldn't explain what had happened. There was no way that was him outside in the dark. The figure I had seen walking away, lighting a cigarette, everything about it was wrong. It looked like him, moved like him, even sounded like him, but there was no way he could have been two places at once. He hadn't left the tent, and I'd heard the zipper. I couldn't deny what I'd seen. I still don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was a trick of the light or my mind playing tricks on me, but it felt too real. I never asked James about it again. He denied everything, and I didn't press it. But that night, something about the forest, the dark, and the isolation made me feel like I'd glimpsed something that wasn't supposed to be there. Something that wasn't him, but something else that looked just like him. I haven't been camping in that spot since, and I don't think I ever will again. Whatever it was, I'm not interested in finding out. I've always been the kind of person who enjoys the outdoors. I've camped all over the place, mountains, forests, lakesides. If it's a place that calls for a tent and a campfire, I've probably been there. And I've had my share of spooky experiences. I mean, who hasn't heard those odd noises at night or gotten that eerie feeling when you're alone in the woods, right? But there's one thing that gets to me more than anything else. The idea of something or someone mimicking the people I know. Something that can walk, talk, and act like someone I trust. That kind of thing makes my skin crawl, and after what happened to me one night while camping, I can't shake the fear that comes with it. It all started on a weekend trip with a few friends. We decided to go camping at a secluded spot, far enough away from the usual weekend crowds, but still close enough for a day hike. The spot was tucked in the middle of a national forest, with thick trees surrounding us, and the closest town was about an hour away. It was a perfect place for a little adventure. No cell service, no distractions, just us and the wilderness. We set up our tents early, gathered firewood, and as the night fell, we cracked open some beers and got comfortable by the fire. The air was chilly, but not uncomfortable, and the smell of pine and damp earth filled the air. It wasn't the first time we'd camped here, but it was the first time we stayed out this late. I had a good feeling about the trip, things felt normal. But as the night wore on, I started feeling that old, familiar sense of unease. You know the one, when you're in the middle of the woods and something just doesn't feel right, even if you can't put your finger on it. I tried to shake it off and laughed along with the others, but deep down, I knew something was off. Around 11:30 p.m., I needed to go to the bathroom. The restrooms were a bit of a walk from our camp, so I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down the narrow path leading through the trees. The woods were eerily quiet, and I didn't like the way the wind sounded, whistling through the branches in an almost unnatural way. Felt like I was being watched. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but that's exactly how it felt. I had to shake the thought out of my head. It was just my mind playing tricks. As I walked, I heard something. Footsteps, soft and light. They were behind me. I stopped dead in my tracks, but the footsteps didn't stop. I turned around, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing. The beam cut through the night, illuminating only a few yards of dirt and trees. I was starting to feel that tightness in my chest, the one that comes when you're certain that something's wrong, but you can't explain why. I quickly turned and continued walking, the footsteps keeping pace with me. I didn't dare look back again. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe it was a raccoon or something else moving in the underbrush. But the more I thought about it, the more it didn't make sense. The footsteps weren't erratic like an animal's would be. They were too rhythmic, too human. When I reached the restroom, I was relieved to be in a more open area, even though the place was far from inviting. I did what I came there to do and washed my hands, trying to shake off the unease. But when I turned to leave, I hesitated. The feeling was stronger now, like someone was standing just outside the door, waiting. My breath caught in my throat as I pushed open the door and stepped back into the dark woods. That's when I saw it, or rather saw him. My friend Sam, who had been sitting by the fire just minutes before, was standing near the trees, about 20 feet away. I could see the outline of him just barely in the dim light of my flashlight. I froze for a second, unsure of what to do. Sam didn't have a flashlight, and there was no reason for him to be out here by the restroom. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. His figure remained still, just standing there. I felt a chill run down my spine. I wasn't sure if it was the darkness or the fact that he wasn't moving at all, but something about it didn't feel right. "Sam!" I called out again, a little louder this time. Finally, he moved, but when he did, it wasn't in a natural way. His movements were jerky, stiff, like he was unsure of what he was doing. It made me uncomfortable. I wanted to call out again, to ask what he was doing, but I couldn't get the words out. I was too confused, too unsettled. I took a step forward cautiously, and that's when I saw it. The way Sam's eyes were staring at me, blank and unblinking, like they weren't his eyes at all. I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart was racing now. I felt a sickening sense of dread settle over me. It wasn't Sam. Couldn't be. I turned and started walking back to the campsite, trying to keep my composure. But I couldn't help myself. I had to glance back. When I did, Sam's figure was gone, disappeared into the shadows. I don't know how long I stood there, just staring at the spot where he had been, but it felt like an eternity. My mind was screaming at me to run back to camp, but my feet felt frozen to the ground. Finally, I gathered the strength to move, and I quickly made my way back to the site. When I got back, I found Sam sitting by the fire, just like before. I couldn't make sense of what had happened. He was laughing, talking with the others, and seemed perfectly normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't say anything to anyone at first. Maybe I was just spooked by the dark, or maybe it was the isolation. I tried to tell myself it wasn't a big deal, but it didn't stop there. A few hours later, around 3 a.m., I woke up needing to pee again. I didn't want to go to the restroom this time, so I just stepped out of the tent, into the woods. The air was cold, the kind of cold that makes you shiver, but I didn't mind. I relieved myself quickly and was about to turn back when I heard something. The unmistakable sound of a tent zipper opening. I paused, listening, my heart racing again. I knew it was Sam. I could hear his breathing, the rustle of his sleeping bag, and the familiar sound of his zipper. But when I turned to look, Sam wasn't there. He was standing by the fire, like he had never left. His face looked different in the firelight, almost like he wasn't fully there. I stood there for a moment, not sure what to think. Then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The Sam who had been by the fire was gone, and the one I had seen earlier in the woods appeared at the edge of the campsite. But it wasn't him. Not really. It was like the way he looked, his gait, his eyes. None of it was right. The figure moved with a jerky, unnatural motion, and I felt the air grow thick with unease. I didn't want to look at it anymore. I turned away, and when I looked back, it was gone. I ran to the fire and stood there, trying to catch my breath. Sam was still sitting there, acting completely normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept looking around, but nothing was there. In the morning, I didn't bring it up to the group. I didn't want them to think I was paranoid or worse, crazy. But I knew what I saw. Whatever that was, it wasn't Sam. I never felt so uneasy around someone I thought I knew so well. The mimicry, the way it could walk like him, sound like him, it terrified me. I still don't know what it was, but I'll never forget the way it made me feel. After that night, I packed up my things and left early, not saying a word to anyone. I'm sure they thought I was just being overdramatic, but I wasn't. That feeling, the one where you know something isn't right but can't explain it, lingered with me long after I left the woods. And now, I have a healthy respect for anything that can mimic another person. Because whatever I saw that night, it wasn't just a prank. It was something much worse. I still don't know what it was, but I've never gone back to that campsite, and I don't think I ever will. We had been camping in the El Dorado National Forest for years. It was kind of a tradition for my friends and me. Somewhere to go and get away from the noise of life, to spend time in nature without the distractions of modern technology. One spot we kept coming back to was along Sopiago Springs. It was remote, peaceful, and far enough from any main roads that we could go there and feel like we were truly alone. We had all kinds of experiences there, some weird, some great, but none like the one that happened on our 3-day foraging trip. The plan was simple enough. We would hike out to a spot near the springs, foraging along the way. We packed in some MREs in case we couldn't find enough food, but we figured we'd mostly be able to gather berries, mushrooms, and maybe even catch a fish or two. We also packed some guns, just in case we needed to hunt for meat. We'd bring some basic camping supplies: tents, tarps, rope, and a fire starter kit. It was going to be a simple trip, but the kind of trip where we'd be out in nature, testing our skills and just enjoying the quiet. The first night went pretty much as expected. We spent the day hiking, setting up camp, and preparing food. My buddy Greg had managed to shoot a squirrel, and we cooked it up along with a bunch of crawdads we caught from the creek. We were all happy with how things were going. We had a few beers, sat around the fire, and told stories like we always did. It was a perfect night. We went to bed around midnight, and aside from the usual sounds of the night, the rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl, we slept soundly. But when I woke up the next day, something didn't feel right. I had been in the woods enough to know when something's off. The air was still, almost unnaturally still, and the forest was dead silent. There was no wind, no rustling of the trees, no birds, no bugs. Just the kind of eerie quiet that makes you feel like the world around you is holding its breath. It was a strange feeling, one that reminded me of some of the creepy experiences I'd had in that part of the forest before. There had been nights in the past where I'd been uneasy, like something was watching us, but it was never quite like this. Normally, when you're in the woods, you know the signs of predators. The way the air changes when a bear or mountain lion is nearby. The slight pressure that settles on your chest when something's stalking you. But this felt different. It didn't feel like a predator. Felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. My friend Matt noticed it too. He was standing by the creek, looking out over the water, when I walked up to him and asked if he felt the same. He didn't say much, just kind of grunted and agreed, but it was obvious that he was feeling the same way. We were both a bit on edge, though we didn't say much about it. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to us. We decided to go ahead and go about our day, foraging for food. But the unease lingered. It wasn't long before things started getting worse. By the time night rolled around, I was starting to feel the weight of the situation. My friends decided they were going to go about 200 yards up the stream to do some scouting and find some more food, leaving me alone at camp. The fire was still burning, and I made sure to keep it going strong. I wasn't about to let it die out. I gathered more wood and stoked the flames, but the whole time, something in my gut was telling me to stay alert. The feeling of being watched had returned, stronger now, like eyes were on me from all sides. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but the forest was still, too still. I didn't like it. Then I started hearing it. Faint voices, muffled but distinct, coming from the opposite direction of where my friends had gone. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but there was no wind, and the sounds were too human, too clear. My heart began to race, and I couldn't help but feel a chill creeping up my spine. It was strange. Whenever I tried to focus on the voices, they seemed to move, like they were coming from one place and then fading away to another. I couldn't make out the words, but it didn't sound right. It didn't sound like the normal noises of the forest, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just people. There was something else out there, something that didn't belong. I grabbed my rifle and settled down by the fire, watching the tree lean carefully. I didn't have a flashlight. My friends had taken both of the ones we had brought, which, in hindsight, was poor planning. I felt naked without a proper light source. All I had was the firelight, casting long, flickering shadows across the forest floor. Then I saw something. I saw a figure moving slowly through the trees about 50 yards out. It was hard to make out exactly what it was. It was dark, and the only light came from the fire, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. At first, I thought it might just be one of my friends, but as I focused in on it through the scope of my rifle, I realized that it wasn't. It didn't move like a person. It was on all fours, but it wasn't crawling like an animal. Its body was low to the ground, almost like it was squatting, and its arms were unnaturally long, too long. The way it moved was jerky, stiff. It looked like it was trying to stay out of sight, but it wasn't doing a very good job of it. I only saw it for a second before it loped off deeper into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I don't know why, but I froze. I couldn't take my eyes off the spot where it had been. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen, but there was no time to think. As soon as it disappeared, the rustling around the camp started again. The leaves shifted, twigs snapped, but it was different now. It wasn't coming from the direction my friends had gone. It was coming from the other side of the camp, the side that had been quiet before. Whatever it was circling me. I gripped my rifle tighter, my knuckles white. I kept my eyes trained on the tree line, waiting for something to appear. My thoughts were scrambled. It felt like I was being stalked, like something was toying with me. I tried to keep calm, tried to convince myself it was just my nerves getting the best of me, but I couldn't. The rustling continued, growing more frequent and louder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was getting closer. My friends came back about 10 minutes later. They saw me sitting there, rifle in hand, staring into the woods, and they immediately knew something was off. I must have looked like a paranoid wreck. I told them what I saw, about the creature in the woods, the voices, the feeling of being watched, but they didn't seem convinced at first. They tried to brush it off, but then they started talking about what had happened when they were up the stream. They heard it too, the same rustling, the same voices, faint and distant, but close enough to make them feel like they weren't alone. They told me they had started to get nervous and decided to head back. That's when we all went silent. We spent the second night with a huge fire and 3 of us keeping lookout. None of us slept. It wasn't that we were scared, not exactly. It was more like we knew something wasn't right. We didn't talk much after that. Everyone stayed in their tents, too nervous to venture out, but too aware that something might be watching us from the darkness. The next morning, we packed up camp as quickly as we could. None of us spoke much, but we all knew that whatever it was we had felt the night before, it was real. We didn't need to say it out loud. We all agreed, without a word, that we were done with that spot. We weren't going back, ever. We got the hell out of there fast, and we never camped in that part of El Dorado National Forest again. I don't know what we saw out there, and I don't really want to know. I just know that there's something out there, something that can make you feel like prey, even when there's no obvious predator. Whatever it wasn't natural, and it wasn't something I ever want to encounter again. I've always been someone who enjoys being out in the woods. Real camping, no RVs or tailgates or inflatable mattresses. I grew up hiking and hunting with my uncle in Southern Oregon, and when I got older, I kept the habit alive by heading out at least once a month to some forest somewhere, setting up a tent and just disconnecting from the noise of modern life. Last year, around mid-September, I decided to check out a state forest in Northern California I hadn't been to before. The weather was just starting to turn cool at night, but the days were still dry and sunny. It was a sweet spot before the real cold moved in, and the crowds were long gone since school was back in session and most summer campers were done for the year. The spot I picked was part of a loop of designated backcountry sites about 2 miles off the main trailhead. You parked in a gravel lot, checked in at a little ranger kiosk, and hiked your way in. There were only about 6 or 7 sites spread out around this loop, each with a fire ring and a crude picnic table, but otherwise it was just you and the trees. I got site number 43, the second to last one on the loop. When I arrived at the lot around noon, there was only one other car parked there. I didn't think much of it. It was a Thursday, and I figured some retiree or a hardcore solo hiker had come in for the peace and quiet. I shouldered my pack, locked up the car, and headed into the trees. The hike in was nice. Peaceful, no noise, no people, just the occasional scurry of a squirrel or a jay overhead. The trail forked a few times, and there were little wooden signs at each fork pointing toward the numbered camps. Mine was 2.2 miles from the lot and sat at the edge of a gently sloping ravine that dropped into a little gully lined with cottonwoods and big, old conifers. A narrow stream ran along the bottom of the gully, but the water was shallow and slow-moving. By 2:30, I had my tent pitched, my pack emptied, and a small fire going. The air had a crisp edge to it, and even though the sun was out, the shadows were long. I set up my folding chair and just sat for a while, enjoying the silence. No traffic, no hum of cities or phones, just the distant trickle of water and the sound of leaves rustling in the wind. I made a quick dinner of beans and rice with my camp stove and cleaned up before the light faded. By the time night rolled in, I had a decent fire going and was sipping on a flask of bourbon. I had brought a little book, but I didn't read. I just stared into the fire and listened to the woods. It was one of those rare moments when you feel perfectly balanced. Calm, alert, alone, but not lonely. Eventually, I put the fire out and climbed into my sleeping bag, zipped up the tent, and let myself drift. Somewhere around 2 a.m., I woke up needing to take a piss. I lay still for a minute, blinking at the ceiling of the tent, listening. There was no sound, no wind, no bugs, nothing. I rolled out of my bag, pulled on a hoodie and boots, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out into the cool air. I didn't go far, maybe 10 steps into the brush, did my business, zipped up, and stood there for a second scanning the trees with the light. And that's when I heard something. It wasn't loud, just a crunch of dried leaves or twigs, maybe 15 or 20 yards downslope in the gully behind my camp. I turned toward the sound, flashlight sweeping through the trees. Nothing. But the weird thing was, there should have been something. That's how loud it was. It wasn't an animal scurrying. It sounded more like something heavier, like a footstep. I stood there a few seconds longer, then shook it off and went back to the tent. The next morning was quiet again. I made coffee, ate a granola bar, packed a small day pack, and decided to hike around the loop to check out the other sites. Site number 44, the last on the loop, was maybe half a mile away. It looked empty. No smoke from a fire ring, no tarp or tent, no backpacks. The site before mine, number 42, was maybe a quarter mile up in the other direction. It was empty, too. That was when I started to wonder about that other car in the lot. I hadn't seen or heard anyone. No hikers, no voices, no distant sounds of tent zippers or camp stoves. Felt like I was totally alone. That afternoon, I took my fishing rod down to the little stream. There wasn't much biting, but it gave me something to do. I followed the water a ways down the ravine, moving slowly, casting here and there. It was quiet, still, and just cool enough to need a jacket. Around 4:30, I turned back, planning to be at my site with a fire going before sunset. I was almost back to camp when I noticed something that stopped me cold. There were boot prints, big ones, coming up from the ravine. Not mine. I wear trail runners. These were deeper, wider treads. Hiking boots, but big. The steps were spaced wider than mine, too. I bent down to look. The dirt was dry, so they weren't sharp prints, but I could make out a few heel marks. And they weren't coming down from the trail, they were coming up from the opposite side, straight from the thick brush. I looked up the way they'd gone and saw the faint indent where someone had moved between the trees toward my camp. I followed it maybe 20 feet before losing the trail. I stood there for a few seconds, heart beating a little faster. Then I turned and walked straight back to my camp. Fast. When I got there, nothing was disturbed. My tent was zipped. My gear was untouched. I went straight to the fire pit and got the flames going. I added more wood than usual and sat there just watching the trees. That feeling of peace was long gone. I felt watched, like something was out there just past the edge of the firelight. Night came fast and I kept the fire roaring. I sat with the flashlight in my lap and my fixed blade knife in its sheath on my belt. My eyes kept jumping to the dark tree line. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. I just waited. Around 11:30, I heard something again. This time from the gully below me. It was faint, a scrape, a shifting of rocks or maybe dry leaves. Then a pause. Then it came again, closer. Then nothing. I stood up and swept the flashlight toward the slope. Nothing, just trees. I sat back down, legs tense. A while later, I heard another sound, this one higher up behind me on the trail. Same pattern, a crunch, a pause, then silence. I didn't sleep that night. At first light, I packed everything in 20 minutes. Tent down, bag stuffed, gear stowed, fire doused. My hands were shaking as I cinched down the straps. I took one last look toward the gully, then turned and headed back down the trail. And that's when I saw it. There was a tree, a thick old pine about 40 feet off the trail, maybe a quarter mile from camp. On the trunk, someone had pressed something dark and oily into the bark. At first I thought it was moss, but as I got closer, I saw it was a greasy handprint, large and fresh, a smear of dark grime, almost like charcoal mixed with something slick. It reeked, earthy, metallic, like old blood and engine oil. I didn't stop. I didn't look again. I hiked that 2 miles in less than half an hour, burst out into the parking lot, and found the other car still there. A gray sedan, older model. The windows were dusty. Inside was a folded blanket on the back seat and an empty fast food bag on the floor. The doors were locked. I took one last look at the trailhead, climbed into my car, and drove. I never went back to that loop. Never even looked up the park again. I don't know what I saw or didn't see, but I know how it made me feel. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person looking for help. It was something or someone moving with purpose, watching from the trees. Never getting close enough to be seen clearly. Never making a move. Just watching, waiting, staying just outside the firelight. And that was enough. I took a few weeks off from work in early fall and decided to drive across a few states, just to breathe for a while. I had no grand plan, no detailed map, just a rough route that would take me through national parks, side roads, and small towns. My only real goal was to spend time in nature, away from the noise, away from people, and let my head clear out. One afternoon, I ended up deep in a state forest that wasn't all that popular. It didn't have the flashy amenities or the attention the big parks had, which is exactly why I chose it. The place was beautiful, thick trees that reached high and swayed gently in the breeze, ground covered in soft moss and fallen pine needles, a few creeks and rocky outcrops. It felt untouched. I found a clearing well off the main trail, parked my car out of sight behind some dense brush, and set up my camp. Tent, fire pit, hammock. I brought in my supplies in one trip and settled in, feeling more peace than I had in months. That first night was cool, quiet. I sat by the fire, sipping some bourbon from my metal cup, listening to the faint calls of animals in the distance. The stars came out in full, no city light to wash them away. I slept like a stone. The next few days were more of the same. Woke up with the sun, cooked a simple breakfast, hiked around, came back, maybe fished a little, journaled, and sat by the fire again. I saw no one. Felt like I had the whole forest to myself. But things always shift. It was subtle at first. A boot print near the edge of my clearing that wasn't mine. I thought maybe I had just forgotten stepping there earlier, though I doubted it. Then I noticed the subtle shifting of things in my camp. Not a raccoon type of shift, more deliberate. One morning, my folding knife was closed and placed at the foot of my tent. I always kept it clipped to my belt. It wasn't enough to spook me, not then. I was cautious, sure, but chalked it up to absent-mindedness or even an animal dragging it and dropping it nearby. But a couple days later, I heard the sound of a twig snap at night. Close, too close. I sat up in my sleeping bag, heart thumping. I stayed still and listened. The sound didn't come again. I told myself it was a deer, maybe an owl landing hard on a branch. That morning, I found a single piece of jerky, not mine, placed next to my empty pan on the rock I used for cooking. That hit me differently. It was too strange, like someone wanted me to know they'd been there but also wanted to keep it friendly. Still, I couldn't ignore the fact that someone had been that close to my tent while I slept. My body tensed when I found it. I scanned the woods for movement but saw nothing. No voices, no sound, no movement. I considered packing up. I even had my gear halfway back in the car, but something about it felt overblown. I thought maybe a local hunter had wandered close by, meant no harm. so I stayed another night. I kept the fire going longer than usual and had my hatchet close by. But nothing happened. That morning, a jeep rolled through the dirt path leading to the forest edge about 100 yards from my camp. It looked dusty and old. A man and a woman were inside. They slowed down, saw me by the fire, and waved. I waved back. They turned off the engine and climbed out. The man stretched his arms like he'd been driving a while. They both looked like they had come prepared for camping too. Packs in the backseat, water jugs, sleeping bags. They didn't come up close, just stood by the Jeep and said they'd seen my fire from the path and wanted to make sure someone was out here and not in trouble. I nodded and gave a thumbs up. They waved again, got back in, and drove off. I didn't think anything of it. Just other campers. I didn't think about it until later that day when I was out gathering firewood and remembered the jerky, and the boot print, and the knife, all these little things. Then it hit me. What if the man and woman were the ones who had been coming around my camp at night? What if their presence wasn't a coincidence? What if they wanted to see if I recognized them? That unease stayed with me through the evening. I didn't sleep well that night. Every sound felt like something was creeping closer. I didn't hear anything strange, but I also didn't sleep. I waited for the sun like it was some kind of savior. By morning, I had enough. I packed everything up quickly and hiked it back to the car. I wasn't scared in the ghost story way. I was just uneasy in that very real, very human way that something might be off and it's better to listen to your gut. I told myself it was probably nothing. People were good. America was still full of decent folks. But I also didn't want to be that one person who ignored the signs. As I reached my car and loaded the last of my gear in, I noticed a scrap of paper wedged under my windshield. It was a napkin from some diner, the kind you get with a greasy breakfast. Written on it in ballpoint pen were the words, "Beautiful country," right? No signature, no explanation. It wasn't threatening exactly, but it wasn't normal either. I got in and drove off, took a long route home, stayed in a cheap motel that night instead of setting up camp again. I needed 4 walls and a door that locked. That was 3 years ago. I still camp, but I stay closer to main trails now. I don't go quite as deep anymore. I still believe people are good. I do. And I think that most things that happen out there in the woods are normal, explainable. But there's always that 0.01% of the time when something's not right. Something's just a little too careful, a little too subtle, a little too intentional. It doesn't make the world evil. It doesn't make the country broken. It just means sometimes we need to pay attention, listen to our gut, and remember how precious life is. That napkin's still in my glove box. It reminds me that most of the time, everything is fine, but not always. I had always liked the quiet of the woods, the way everything slowed down, the way even your own thoughts felt softer when you were surrounded by nothing but trees, wind, and the occasional rustle of wildlife. It wasn't about escaping people exactly, but just needing time away, time to reset. I've been doing solo camping trips for about 4 years, mostly in state parks or public forest areas where you're allowed to hike out and pitch a tent wherever you want, as long as you followed the rules. That year, I picked a place about 2 hours from where I lived. Not a well-known spot. I like to look for those less popular areas because they were usually cleaner, quieter, and more isolated. I'd done a bit of research and found this patch of land just off a logging road. Technically, it was within a managed forest area, and camping was allowed as long as you didn't leave a mess. I packed my usual gear, double-checked my maps and coordinates, and made sure my phone had a good charge before I set out. The drive there was uneventful. I left early, made a stop for gas and snacks, and pulled onto the old logging road a little after noon. The road was narrow but passable. My SUV handled it fine, even over a few washed-out sections. After about 20 minutes of bumping along at low speed, I found a small clearing just off the side, maybe 20 or 30 yards in. It wasn't an official site. No picnic table, no fire ring, but it was flat and dry, with a thick patch of trees between the clearing and the road. Felt perfect. Remote but not too far from the road in case I needed to leave. I unpacked, set up my tent in the back corner of the clearing where the ground was soft but not too soft, and laid out my gear. Sleeping bag, food storage, camp stove, water filter, the usual stuff. I hung my food up in a bear bag, even though I hadn't seen much evidence of bears in the area. Better safe than sorry. By early evening, I had everything in place and was sitting on a log I'd rolled near the fire ring I made with rocks. I had a simple dinner and spent the next hour just listening. There's something deeply relaxing about being that far from people. No car sounds, no planes overhead, just crickets, birds, the occasional crack of a twig in the woods from some animal minding its own business. I went to sleep early, the way you do when the sun goes down and there's nothing else to distract you. I zipped up my tent, turned off my headlamp, and pulled the sleeping bag around my shoulders. I woke up sometime in the night, maybe 3 or 4 in the morning. I wasn't sure what woke me. It was still dark, and the woods were mostly silent, except for a soft breeze through the trees. I listened for a while but didn't hear anything out of place. Maybe a dream had startled me. I rolled over and went back to sleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal. I had breakfast, packed a small day pack, and hiked a few miles up a nearby ridge. I took my time, snapped a few photos, sat by a stream for a while, then made my way back to camp before the afternoon heat kicked in. When I got back, I noticed something odd. It was small, but it caught my eye right away. One of the tent stakes had been pulled up and was lying next to the tent. At first, I figured I hadn't set it deep enough. Maybe the wind had worked it loose, or the ground had shifted overnight. I pushed it back in, checked the rest, and didn't think much more about it. That night, I followed the same routine. Dinner, small fire, some reading. I was asleep by 9. This time I woke up because I heard something. A soft crunch, a deliberate footstep. My whole body tensed up immediately. It wasn't an animal. Animals are lighter, less careful. This sounded like someone trying to move quietly but not quite pulling it off. I held still and waited. My heart was pounding. There was another crunch, and this time it was closer to the tent. I couldn't see anything. The tent was zipped up tight and there was no moonlight to see by, but I could hear slow, measured steps, then nothing. I waited for what felt like forever. At some point, I must have fallen asleep again, because I woke up to the sun coming through the tent. I unzipped the flap slowly and looked around. Everything seemed untouched, but there were footprints. Human footprints. Barefoot. They weren't mine. I always wore boots. These were wide, long, and dirty. The prints came from the woods, circled the tent once, then disappeared back into the trees. My stomach dropped. Someone had been walking around my tent. At night, without shoes. I spent the next hour debating whether to pack up and leave. But I didn't. I told myself it could have been a hiker who got turned around, or some backwoods guy living off the grid. Weird, but not necessarily dangerous. I had food, water, and gear. I wasn't helpless. Still, I kept my hatchet nearby that night. I even laid out a few sticks and dry leaves around the tent's perimeter so I'd hear if anything approached. That night, I barely slept. I thought I heard something again, but it might have been paranoia. I kept imagining that barefoot figure moving around in the dark, watching. The next morning, I made the decision to leave. I started packing right after breakfast, working fast but trying not to look like I was scared. That's when I found the message. A small pile of rocks had been arranged just outside the clearing. 3 stacks, maybe a foot high each, placed neatly in a row. They hadn't been there before. I would have noticed. I looked around, heart pounding. No one in sight, no movement, no sound. I tore down the tent, threw everything into the back of my SUV, and got out of there as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again. When I got home, I went through my gear. Nothing missing. No sign that anything had been touched. But I still felt off, like I had been on someone else's land without knowing it, like I'd crossed some invisible line. That trip stuck with me. I still go camping, but I'm more cautious now. I pick areas with at least a few other campers. I carry more protection, and I trust my gut. If something feels wrong, I leave. Looking back, I don't think the person meant to hurt me, but I also don't think they were just passing through. The bare footprints, the rocks, the pulled-up tent stake, it all felt like a warning, a silent message that I wasn't welcome, that someone had been watching. And that next time, maybe they wouldn't just walk around the tent. That's the part that bothers me most, because I don't know how long they stood there, or how close they got. I went camping alone in the early fall of last year, sometime around the second week of September. I remember it clearly because it was just after Labor Day, when most people had already packed up for the season. The kids were back in school, families were done with their summer trips, and the state parks and forests were starting to empty out. That was exactly what I was looking for. Peace, quiet, and no one around. I'd grown tired of crowds, noise, and schedules. I wanted the kind of silence you only get in the woods when the closest other person might be miles away. I wanted to stretch out the last bit of decent weather before fall really started turning. I chose a remote spot in the Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest in northern Wisconsin. I'd camped in that forest a few times over the years, but never too deep. This time, I found an unmarked access point through some old logging roads I'd found on an old satellite map. I parked my truck along a narrow, unused service trail that was blocked off with rocks, shouldered my pack, and started walking. It was about 4 miles in, following an old ATV trail that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There were no signs, no trash, no boot prints, no sounds of cars. Just trees, wind, and me. I wasn't scared. I had a reliable GPS with an offline map, a paper map and compass as backup, and I'd left my trip details with my cousin, just in case. I had a solid tent, good clothes, food for 5 days, and a satellite communicator I kept clipped to my chest strap. I was ready, or at least I thought I was. The first night was peaceful. I found a flat area near a stream, not too close to attract animals, but close enough that I could refill water with my filter. I set up camp, built a small fire with some dry wood and birch bark, and cooked one of those freeze-dried meals. It was almost dark when I finished eating. The stars started to pop out through the thin treetops and the temperature dropped fast. I crawled into my tent, read for a bit with a headlamp, then turned everything off and fell asleep. The forest was quiet, just the occasional rustle of wind through leaves, the chirp of crickets, and now and then, a distant owl. The second day was uneventful. I hiked farther away from camp during the day, just wandering, following deer trails, climbing small ridges to get a better look at the lay of the land. I saw a couple of deer, some squirrels, and a fox that darted away as soon as it saw me. I marked my location regularly on my GPS and had a good sense of where I was the whole time. I returned to camp in the early evening, made another small fire, and cooked again. It was warmer that night, so I left the tent flap partly open with the bug net zipped. I remember laying there, just listening. It was calm. The third day is when things started to shift. I woke up a little later than usual, maybe around 8 a.m., and immediately noticed something felt off. It took me a few minutes to realize that the little pile of sticks I'd gathered and left near the fire ring was gone. Not scattered, gone. I checked around, thinking maybe wind or an animal had moved it, but nothing. It was just gone. That was strange, but I didn't overthink it. Maybe I'd put it somewhere else and forgot. Later that day, I went out again exploring. I brought my day pack, some snacks, my water filter, and my GPS. I headed a bit east, toward a rocky outcrop I'd seen on the topo map. Took about 2 hours of slow walking, bushwhacking in some places, but I eventually got there. It was beautiful mossy rocks, a view of a long shallow valley, and the tops of trees stretching for miles. I sat there for a while, just drinking water and taking it in. On the way back to camp, I noticed something else strange. A stick, maybe 2 inches thick and about 2 feet long, was jammed vertically into the ground on the side of the trail. It wasn't natural. Someone had pushed it into the soft dirt, and it stood there like a marker. I knew I hadn't seen it on the way in. It wasn't rotted or fallen. It was placed. It had bark stripped off one end like it had been whittled a little. I stood there staring at it for a while. It was probably nothing, maybe a hunter or another camper, but it didn't sit right with me. I pulled it out, tossed it into the woods, and moved on. That night, I couldn't relax. I kept hearing sounds that didn't belong. Short, sharp sounds, not the usual rustling. Twigs snapping once, then silence. A shift in the air. The type of silence that presses in on your ears and makes you strain to hear more. I turned off my light and just listened. Something was nearby. I was sure of it, but it never came close, and I eventually fell asleep sometime after midnight. When I woke up the next morning, there were boot prints in the dirt around my tent, clear as day. Not mine, bigger, wider. They'd circled the tent and stopped near where I kept my cooking gear. I stood there staring at them for several minutes, my heart pounding in my throat. I hadn't heard anyone. No voices, no footsteps, just those prints. They weren't old. The dew had only started drying, and the edges were still sharp. I packed everything up in a rush. I didn't even cook breakfast. I just shoved my stove, tarp, sleeping bag, and tent into my pack and started walking out. I planned to get back to the truck by early afternoon. I kept checking over my shoulder the whole time. I took the same trail I'd come in on. There weren't any other options out unless I bushwhacked for miles. I moved fast, my head on a swivel, my chest tight the whole time. But about halfway out, I saw something that made me stop cold. My boot prints, the ones I'd made coming in 3 days before, were still there in the dried mud in certain shaded parts of the trail. But now there were other prints, not the same ones from my camp. Smaller, narrower, like someone had followed me on the way in, stepping into the same path but slightly off. They were faint, but they were there. I didn't even want to think about what that meant. I made it back to the truck without stopping, threw my pack in the bed, jumped into the cab, and started driving. That old logging road was rough, and I drove too fast, hitting rocks and ruts harder than I should have. But I didn't care. I just wanted out. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station about an hour and a half later. It was only then, standing under fluorescent lights near the pump, that I let myself breathe again. I didn't call anyone. I didn't report it. What would I say? Someone might have been watching me? There wasn't any real proof of anything. Just footprints, a stick, a missing pile of wood. Maybe I imagined some of it. Maybe. But I know what I saw. Since then, I haven't gone camping alone again. I still get the urge sometimes. I'll pull up maps, look at gear, plan trips in my head. But when it comes time to actually go, I feel that tightness in my chest again. That memory of standing in the middle of the woods, realizing I wasn't alone, and maybe never had been. And that's what really sticks with me. The thought that someone else had followed me in, watched me, came up to my tent at night, and I never saw them. Not once. They didn't take anything, didn't leave anything obvious. Just let me know they were there. That's the part one can't get over. Not what happened, but what didn't. Because if someone had wanted to hurt me out there was nothing stopping them. No neighbors, no phones, no one to hear me yell. Just trees, just silence, and someone watching from the dark.